Hello YouTube, welcome back to another book review from me, your host, Logan Albright. As you may know about me, I'm something of an Anglophile. I love English culture, I love English pubs, I love English geography, English architecture, English history, I even love English food, believe it or not. So imagine my delight when one of my favorite English comedians had written a book on the history of the English monarchy. I was very excited by this, and the person I'm talking about is, of course, David Mitchell, not the man who wrote Cloud Atlas, but a very distinguished and hilarious English comedian who I've been following for many years. And he came out with this book, Unruly, The Ridiculous History of England's Kings and Queens. And I thought this is going to be a perfect book for me. That's exactly the kind of topic I'm interested in, and it's exactly the kind of author I like. So I was ready to go, and I got a copy of the book, and I read it. And this is the part of the job I hate, because I now have to tear this book apart and say why it's not a very good history book, which is a shame, because I like the author, and I like the subject. But I think the real failing of this book is that it tries to do two things at the same time, and it succeeds at doing neither of them very well, which those two things are recounting the history of the kings and queens of England and trying to be funny. And I don't think it really does any of those things. It really only focuses on the kings starting from the Anglo-Saxon period to Elizabeth I. It doesn't talk about anything after the Elizabeth I, because that's kind of where that's when Shakespeare was around. And David Mitchell famously played Shakespeare in a show called Upstart Crow. And he is interested in Shakespeare, and he refers back to Shakespeare a lot in the book. So clearly that's a source of inspiration for him, and he feels like anything after that is not worth covering. So it's a little bit of a more narrow range of monarchs that are covered than you might have seen in other books. And I want to compare it to this other book that I read a few years ago called Gwen's Kings and Queens. And I actually kind of tore this book apart as well in a previous video, but for being overly opinionated and needlessly contrarian. But in retrospect, it was a very enjoyable book, and it was very informative. And I found it a good contrast with David Mitchell's book, because I didn't find David Mitchell's book particularly enjoyable or particularly informative. I think maybe what I'll do is read a contrasting passage from each book to kind of give you an example of what I'm talking about here. David Mitchell's book tends to drift off into tangents and anecdotes a lot of the time in a presumed attempt to be funny. I don't find them particularly funny, but to me it felt like padding. It's about a 400-page book, and it covers quite a lot of kings and queens, so that's not a huge page count for that. But nevertheless, it felt very padded, like it could have been a lot shorter for the actual amount of information it conveys. And then the organization of it I found quite poor, because he'll often start chapters with how the king died, and then jump back and forth in time. And he seems to assume, I think he's obviously writing for a British audience. He seems to assume a lot of knowledge about the monarchs that I didn't necessarily have, or that a lot of people don't necessarily have. And that bothered me. So this kind of haphazard organization of their lives, to talking about their death, and then going back to their birth, and then talking about their kingship, and then having crazy random asides and jokes and sarcastic comments scattered throughout, it made it hard for me to really focus on and retain the actual pieces of factual information in the book. I found it difficult to sort those out from the jokey stuff to really stick in my mind. And I prefer a much more straightforward book, or if it's going to try to be funny, I wish it were funnier, because I didn't really find it that funny. So let me read, if you'll indulge me. This is the entry, chapter 10, on King Offa the Mighty from the House of Mercia, which is one of the Anglo-Saxon kings. I like the Anglo-Saxon kings before the Normans came and ruined everything and made everything French. Not so good. This is a fairly short entry. It's only 3 paragraphs, so I'm going to read it in its entirety, and you can get a sense of what the style of this Gwen's Kings and Queens book is, and then we'll contrast it with David Mitchell's chapter on the same king and see how they differ. So King Offa the Mighty, reigned from 757 to 796, the greatest king since the earliest days to have reigned in England up to that time. While he was king, the chiefs of East Anglia, Essex, and Kent became his vassals. Most notably, he built an immense ditch, known today as Offa's Dyke, running 140 miles from the River Dee to the River Severn, to protect England from invasions by the Welsh. Gotta stop those Welsh. During his reign, the Danes, inhabitants of what are now called Norway and Sweden, and also known as the Vikings, began invasion of the country, which involved plundering and burning towns and monasteries and sailing back home with their booty. The supremacy of the House of Mercia ended with King Offa's death, and after a period of 8 years during which no monarchs reigned, passed to the House of Wessex, the supremacy of which lasted for 2 centuries. And then it goes on to talk about the House of Wessex. Very straightforward. Doesn't go into a lot of detail, but we don't know that much about these kings, but just kind of explains who the king was, what he did, what happened to him, and what happened afterwards. Now, I will read from the chapter on King Offa of Mercia from David Mitchell's book, and it begins like this. When my wife and I are visiting a nice town or village for the first time, the question we always ask is, where's the bit? That's what we're looking for, the main bit, the nice bit, the bit you're supposed to go and walk around where the stuff is, the bit that once seen gives you the authority to say you've been to the place. Tourists judge a place by its bit, even if locals eschew the bit because they're inured to its beauties and obsessed with the difficulty of parking. Anything from a substantial village to a small city will have one bit. Sorrento in Italy, where we have spent a few holidays, is blessed with 2 bits, and we've been going there for several years before we discovered the second one. It's the Old Port. Metropolises like London and New York can have several bits, and LA has no real bit at all, but quite large places still have only one. Cambridge and Bath, for example, have relatively sizable bits, but only one each. The bit isn't really the place, though. It's only a small part of the place. It's just the bit you don't want to miss because it's most characteristic of the place. Well, in the history of Anglo-Saxon England, we finally found the bit. It's the mid to late 8th century. That's the main bit, the normal bit, when the era of Anglo-Saxon England was properly up and running, but hadn't started to run out. So that's the first page of the chapter on, the 7-page chapter on King Offa of Mercia, bearing in mind that the entry for King Offa in this book was only 1 page. This one is 7 pages, and it's all padding. There's barely any information about King Offa of Mercia. It's all these kind of semi-humorous asides, which I don't really find funny, that just pad out the book and don't really tell you that much about the subject. And when I was reading it, I felt myself very irritated because I was like, get to the point. I want to hear about the kings and queens. I want to hear what they did. And if you want to characterize what they did in a humorous way, that's fine. If you want to make it more fun and engaging, I have no problem with that. I don't think history books need to be dry or boring at all. They can be very exciting and have lots of humor in them. But it just feels like he's dancing around the points he's trying to make in order to fill out the word count of the book, or in order to try to be funny, rather than actually addressing the subject matter. I also thought the book seemed very under-researched to me. If I was going to write a book on a subject like this, I would want to do a lot of research because it's a huge topic. You're covering dozens of kings, dozens of queens, dozens of monarchs, not dozens of queens, but several queens, dozens of monarchs. And I would want to read, I don't know, probably at least 50 books on the subject before I really wanted to attempt writing a book like this. The further reading section, there's not a bibliography or a notes section really. There's a further reading section in David Mitchell's book. Contains 13 entries, which to me seems like not nearly enough. This book contains over 90 entries in its bibliography, and granted, it covers more monarchs because it goes all the way up to Elizabeth II, but it's also not any longer. It's about the same length of a book. It's actually shorter. It's only 300 pages, where this one's 400, and it contains over 90 entries in the bibliography. So it seems much more stringently researched. My own books, like Libertarian Paganism, which I wrote, you should buy that. My own book that I wrote here, before I wrote this book, I had read well over 100 books on libertarianism and well over 100 books on paganism before I felt qualified to write it. And it's got a further reading section that I think it contains about 50 entries, something like that. But certainly more than 13. It's got a lot of stuff in there. And this is quite a short book with quite a limited scope. So I think it's kind of interesting that David Mitchell has only read, or he's probably read more than this. It's unfair of me to say he's only read, but he only recommends for further reading and only cites 13 other works on the monarchs of Britain. It really feels like he just didn't do enough homework to really be qualified to write a book of this magnitude. So I have to say, much as it pains me, and much as I love David Mitchell's work, and if you haven't seen his work, I highly recommend you check it out. He did a sketch show called That Mitchell and Webb Look, which is all on YouTube. He's a regular host on a panel show called Would I Lie to You, which is all on YouTube. He's been on many other panel shows. He's been on QI a lot. He's been on 8 out of 10 Cats and things like that. He's been on Mock the Week. You can look him up. He's been on lots of different British panel shows, and he's hilarious, and I love him. But I really feel like his talents do not lie in writing books, especially not history books. This is the first history book he's written, and the first book of his that I've read. I know he's written a couple of other books that are like memoirs or, kind of more humorous books about more mundane topics. But when tackling a subject like this, he just didn't seem up to the job, and I was let down by it. So that's really all I have to say about Unruly, The Ridiculous History of England's Kings and Queens by David Mitchell, not the guy who wrote Cloud Atlas. I want to be very clear on that. It's a different guy. But it, just didn't do it for me. So I really say, if you're going to try to write a history book, like, focus on the history. You can make it humorous if you want, but I think trying to do two things at the same time is really ends up being both of them are not very good, and so you kind of divide your forces, and you don't focus as heavily as you should on one thing. Sorry, David Mitchell. I love you. You're great, but can't say I recommend your book. I gave it 2 stars on Goodreads, and that's all I really have to say. If you want to read more about the history of the kings and queens of England, this is the only other book I've read apart from Geoffrey of Monmouth's history, which is considered a pseudo-history book, not really accurate in any sense, but this one's better. I'll probably read more books on the subject in the future because I read this several years ago and I've already forgotten a lot of the information in it, and I'd like to refresh it and kind of get my my kings and queens to stick in my mind more because I think it's a really interesting subject. But that's all I have for today. Hope you enjoyed this review of Unruly by David Mitchell. I will be back next week with another book review for you every Wednesday. Make sure you check back and see what crazy thing I'm reading next. You never know what it's going to be. In the meantime, if you enjoyed this review, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, click the bell for notifications, and leave me lots of comments down below because I always enjoy reading your comments. And I love my regulars who come back and comment on every video. It's very nice to see you guys. Thanks for being loyal fans, and I'll catch you next time. Take it easy.